The most famous case of an Israeli military officer accused of war crimes was the trial of Ariel Sharon, which happened in Belgium in 2002. Sharon was the Israeli defense minister during the 1982 Lebanon War, and his role in the Sabra and Shatila massacres, in which hundreds of Palestinian refugees were killed, was the subject of this trial. A group of Belgian citizens had filed a lawsuit against Sharon, accusing him of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Sharon was not present in court and he did not testify, but the case received significant media attention. It was seen as a test case for the application of universal jurisdiction in international law. The Belgian court ultimately dismissed the case, ruling that Sharon was immune from prosecution as a sitting head of state. Sharon at that time was serving as Prime Minister of Israel. But if that case were to happen today, 20 years on, many Israelis fear that the outcome may not be the same. And that's because many Israeli officers will not have sanction from prosecution thanks to the possible undermining of Israel's judiciary that's being carried out by the Benjamin Netanyahu government. There have been weeks of protests now in Israel against the proposed judicial reforms under the new government of Netanyahu. A plan by the Prime Minister to severely curtail the powers of Israel's Supreme Court has prompted weeks of demonstrations. It first rattled the legal community, then the country's bustling technology sector, and now the unthinkable has happened. It is roiling Israel's defense forces. Hundreds of soldiers in the military reserves either have signed letters expressing a reluctance to participate in non-essential duty, or they've already pulled out of training missions. The affected units include the 8200 Division, which deals with signal and cyber intelligence. And it's not just them, even the elite combat forces have been affected. The military leadership fears that growing anger within the ranks over the government's plans will affect operational readiness. On Crux Decode, what is this controversial plan by the Israeli government on judicial reforms? Will this lead to defense officers not taking orders from their superiors? What will be the legal sanctity of judicial orders passed by courts if they are seen as subservient to the government? The most telling illustration of this rot has been the unrest within the Israeli Air Force, with reserve duty pilots increasingly upset over the government's plans. They also fear that they may be asked to engage in illegal operations. Israel has regular air operations in the Gaza Strip and now increasingly in Syria. If the validity of these orders are challenged, then Israeli defense officers may have to face prosecution in front of the International Criminal Court, something they have not had to do all these years. Reserve duty pilots are very often the ones who carry out these airstrikes. The unrest within the military is the latest flare-up to the government's plans to overhaul the judiciary. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets of cities like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and others. Prominent American Jews have also criticized these plans. Michael Bloomberg, for instance, the former New York mayor, wrote a New York Times guest essay saying that Mr. Netanyahu was courting disaster. The US President Joe Biden so far has not said anything about these plans. But for many Israelis, anger within the military is perhaps the most worrying reaction. These reforms, if enacted, would increase government control over how judges are chosen. It would also limit the Supreme Court's ability to strike down new legislation, and it would make it easier for Parliament to overrule the court. Basically, in a government system where both the legislature and the judiciary were seen as equals, this makes the latter subservient to the former. Nearly 50 squadron leaders representing hundreds of reserve pilots met last week with the head of the Israeli Air Force. They expressed their misgivings about this judicial overhaul. The pilot corps is overwhelmingly staffed by reservists who usually report for duty 3 or 4 times a month. More than 30 pilots from a key F-15 fighter jet squadron later wrote to the Air Force chief saying that they would pull out of training as part of these protests. Many Israelis believe the government's plan to overhaul the judiciary will undermine the country's democracy. That view is shared by many military officers, a number of whom have participated in these regular protests. To the government's supporters, the judicial changes it is pushing through Parliament are an essential means of giving a majority of elected lawmakers primacy over unelected judges. But to critics, the overhaul would remove one of the few checks on governmental overreach in a country that does not have a formal constitution. It would also threaten Israel's minority Arabs, who anyway face the brunt of majoritarian attacks. Both sides have accused each other of attempting a coup. In fact, a recent poll amongst Israelis suggested that about a third of the country fears that civil war could break out because of this crisis. Israelis have attended mass rallies every week against these proposals since the beginning of this year. It is one of the longest and biggest waves of protests in Israeli history. Because the overhaul would undermine judicial independence in Israel, it might bolster the argument that the Israeli court system is not fit enough to adjudicate on alleged crimes committed by Israeli defense personnel. In turn, that might put pressure on prosecutors at the International Criminal Court in The Hague to charge Israeli officers for their misdoings. That, in the view of many serving as well as retired officers, would be suicidal. Israel so far has not allowed any of its military officers to be tried in international courts for orders that are given by the state. But if Israeli courts are seen as obeying the government of the day, then that might have to change and the international courts will have to come into play. There is an alternate proposal that's been suggested by the Israeli president. For now, there are few takers in the current Israeli government, which has a significant presence of far-right leaders as part of this coalition. But ultimately, the ball is going to be in the court of Prime Minister Netanyahu, whether he feels that this is a fight that is worth fighting, staking his entire government, perhaps even his entire legacy on, or whether there is a compromise that he can arrive at by taking this president's formula and then working around it with the Israeli Defense Forces, the legal community, and the tech sector, various stakeholders who've had their own concerns around these controversial judicial reforms.
न थके न झुके और आज दोबारा आ गए.
The game pretty much changed in those first 40 minutes.
It's what you do after failure that defines who you are.
Walking the streets of the future is really going to be breathtaking.